Welcome in, I'm Artris, and in this video, I'll be going over what I consider to be the best decks to pilot in a competitive environment for the OP15 format. Of course, as is the nature of tier list, this is opinion-based, so if my opinion differs than yours, that's totally fine. Let me know in the comments. All I ask is that you just keep it respectful. In order to categorize these decks, we have the S through F tier. What do these tiers even mean? The S tier is the meta-defining tier, which means that these decks that are in this tier, I would expect to win tournaments quite frequently. You would expect these decks to shape the meta and people to try to figure out how to beat these decks. The A tier is what I call the event topping decks. These are decks that I would consider to be top tier decks, no doubt would likely be in the top 16. These decks though might have something that is holding them back from winning consistently, whether that is the S tier decks really just stomping them in one matchup, or maybe there's a random rogue deck that's preventing them from doing something. But these decks you would very likely take to an event like a Treasure Cup or a regional, and I would consider these decks that you could win with. The B tier is reserved for competitive decks. These are decks that have a lot of oomph to what they're trying to do. They have a great game plan, but once again, maybe there's something that is holding them back from really winning consistently. I think the B tier decks are the ones that struggle with some consistency issues, or maybe the power level of the deck is not quite as strong as something in the A or the S tier. The C tier is for rogue decks. Now, rogue decks are decks that I think have the potential to do really well at big tournaments, but maybe they don't have enough sample size, or maybe there's not enough piloting the deck overall. Usually the secret sauce is within these decks themselves, and I think that this tier has a lot of respect to it because these decks might pop off, but I don't expect them to over the course of a meta. F tier are decks that you should just leave at your locals. I want to make a very important distinction here. These decks do not suck. Some of them might, but most of them that are in this tier are not going to be bad decks necessarily, but I wouldn't have the full confidence taking these to a tournament and doing well with, and I also expect other people to probably feel the same about these decks overall. So if you find the leader that you're piloting in the F tier in my tier list, don't take offense to it. It doesn't mean that it's bad. You could probably do well with it. Maybe somebody will do well with it. I just don't think that they will do well in the grand scheme of the meta. Starting off, we'll go ahead and cover red. We'll try to do things in order of color here. So with starter deck 21 Luffy, this is here and probably will continue to be in my tier list for the rest of time until it gets rotated out as a meme. And more than anything else, I had a couple of people that were very adamant about this deck being strong a couple sets ago, and it just didn't do anything. And my comments were definitely a lot of, "We're starter deck 21 red Luffy, how dare you disrespect it?" So as a respect to them, I will put this in here, but it's going to go straight to the F tier. The reason why, and I'll try to do my best to explain why decks are where they are, the starter deck 21 red Luffy doesn't really get too much support that supports what it's trying to do. Red in general for the OP15 EBO4 second half isn't necessarily that well supported. The only card that is really playable for red out of everything that we received is the 7-cost 9,000 power rush or character rush Zoro that also buffs your leader. Sure, this is great in this deck, but that card isn't necessarily driving your game plan. With this leader, I think you're trying to be as aggressive as possible, and sure, rush character is nice, but it doesn't really mean that that deck is going to be in a top tier. As for Shanks, I think Shanks is also suffering from red not really getting a tremendous amount of support in this set. I think that the deck overall will continue to be a pretty solid deck, and one of the things about Shanks is that it was a pudding victim, and so now with pudding banned, you can feel comfortable hoarding a lot of cards. With Shanks, I think one of the problems that you had was you had to feel like you needed to counter out against a lot of these decks that were running any kind of potential pudding plays, and especially if you remember back in OP09 when Blue Doflamingo from OP01 was one of the strongest decks in the format, and you had to go against that deck as Shanks. You didn't have the opportunity to really be able to counter out effectively. You'd have to drop a lot of cards or whatever it may be, and if you didn't, you got punished by pudding. You don't have to worry about that anymore for a couple of reasons. One, OP01 Doflamingo is no longer in the meta, but also pudding is just gone altogether. And so is Red Rock. So those cards, of course, are great answers to Shanks. I think Shanks will do better in the OP15 meta than it has done in previous sets, but I don't think that it's going to be doing well enough to be able to top an event or do well in an event. Unfortunately, I don't see it doing well, and so I'm going to keep it at the Leave It Locals tier. Once again, though, this doesn't mean that it's bad. I just think that it suffers from the other colors being a little bit stronger than what it's trying to do. Rayleigh didn't get too much support in that category either. He got one event from EBO4, and he doesn't really need more events. I think the events he had were fine. The event that he did get is a nice little way to trade into a body. It's a 0 cost minus 2,000 or something, and also a 2k counter as well. But once again, not enough support for this to really be bumped up past anything plus the Leave It Locals tier. Red Law in OP14, I actually thought was a solid rogue deck. Unfortunately, I just didn't see it being piloted very well or at all in general. And I think we'll continue to see this deck also not be piloted. And as a result, I think it's going to be still a Leave It Locals deck. A lot of the red decks, unfortunately, just a horrible way to start off the tier list, are going to be in the F tier. We'll get to a few in a second that won't be, but I think that unfortunately Red Law is just not really getting too much support. And on top of that, it didn't really do well in the previous set. So if it didn't get anything to strengthen it, and it already wasn't as strong as maybe some of the other decks that were doing really well, like Green Mihawk, for instance, then this deck will continue to not do well. Red Green Odin was a deck that I consider to be one of those rogue decks that could potentially pop off in the last set, because EBO4, with the green support that it got, I think actually strengthened this deck quite a lot. And on top of that, we didn't really see too much of it being played, because I think there was just a lot of people sticking to one or two decks for the meta, whether that's Green Mihawk, it could have been Purple Yellow Rosinante, or any of the Blue Yellow leaders that are strong. This leader just didn't really fare up too well into those. I think it's still a strong deck, and I think it could potentially be a rogue deck, because the 7-cost Zoro actually does really well in this deck specifically, because with this leader ability being able to buff your leader up if you have a Land of Wano 5-cost or higher and you have a Dawn underneath it, then you also have the 7-cost Rush character Zoro. On top of that, you're looking at like an 8k leader on most turns if you can play that down consistently. So I do think that this leader is worth experimenting with, and it could potentially do something in a tournament. So I'm going to put it into the C tier. Red Green Smoker was a deck that I think has been slowly being hit by the power creep, but with the EBO4 Red Smoker and Tashigi, and also the Red Rush character Zoro, I think this deck is actually worth playing. And I don't know if it's going to be a competitive deck or if it's going to be more of a rogue deck. We will have to see how the meta shapes out a little bit more. But I think with the amount of yellow decks that are starting to be buffed by the pudding ban, I think that this deck actually could do very well into those yellow decks, because of the fact that it runs the 5-cost Smoker, which has Banish. And of course, the Smoker and Tashigi having Rush, and then also buffing your character on defense. And then you have the 7-cost Zoro on top of that, buffing you for offense and defense. I think that this leader has a lot of potential. I think that unfortunately it does have a problem with card draw, which it always has, but its game plan has changed from the Fortress 8-cost Kid build that I've seen going around. Obviously that has changed over time and not necessarily the default, but now that that is not an option, I think the aggressive route is a lot more viable, and especially with yellow being as strong as it is, Green Smoker, the 5-cost 7,000 power Banish card, is an MVP for this deck. So as a result, I'm going to put it at the top of the rogue tier. Keep in mind that within the tiers themselves, I'm not going to be as accurate as far as like, this is the best of C, this is the worst of C. I'll do my best to try to do that, but with the S and the A, I'll definitely be doing that. With C and B, I'll try to do it, but it's going to be a little bit difficult. For now, though, I do think that Smoker is a better option than maybe a Red-Green Odin. With Red-Green Luffy, this is a deck that I definitely slept on last set. I think it was a rogue deck in my opinion. I thought that it would be one that if it was piloted by somebody that was really into the deck and could put a lot of hours into it, it would do well. And as we saw, there was somebody that ended up going to Worlds based off of this deck. But outside of that, I didn't really see it perform too much. And I expect it to probably have the same performance overall. Maybe one or two people doing really well, exceptionally well on this deck. Outside of that, I'm not entirely sure that this deck will thrive in the current environment we have. I don't think it's going to be awful. I definitely think it will be a competitive deck. I'm going to put it at the B tier, competitive. It's probably either A or B. It's like a high B or a low A for me. The reason that I think this deck got better is because of the 7-cost Zoro that I've been talking about. It is a Straw Hat character, so you can protect it with your leader ability, plus also having your leader be a 7k leader base for an entire turn cycle, plus also your leader ability makes it a lot easier to counter out of hits that you might not have been able to counter out of the last set. So I think that this leader just gets a little bit stronger. It does have a similar game plan to the previous set. Not too much has changed for it, but that 7-cost Zoro is a huge plus for the deck overall and what it's trying to do. I am probably going to come back to this one. It might be a low A, but right now I'm going to have it at a high B. Red-Green Krieg is an interesting leader. When we first saw it come out, I thought that this was going to be the best deck out of OP15 based off of the leader ability alone. It says Dawn ×1 on your opponent's turn. If you only have East Blue characters on your side of the field, all of your opponent's side of the board gets minus 2000 power, which is a really huge debuff. And then also the other part of the ability, it says activate main. You may rest one of your opponent's characters that has 2 given Dawn underneath it. So it plays around giving Dawn to your opponent's characters. And so that seems like a really strong combination of what the abilities can do. But the support that came out with it is a little underwhelming. There's not a lot of good East Blue characters overall that you're going to want to put into this deck. I think most of them come out from this set. Obviously, the 7 cost 9,000 power Shanks from the previous OP14 set is one you're going to want to include as well. But outside of that, you're kind of starving for good East Blue characters. The abilities alone are incredibly strong, but I think out of all of the new leaders, this is probably one of the weakest ones because of the support. Just the support for it's not that strong. You're locked to playing East Blue for the most part. You could obviously change that, but the minus 2000 debuff that you get to your opponent's side of the board is just incredibly overwhelming that you're not going to want to stray from that game plan too much. But of course, the cards that it comes with just aren't that great. So I'm going to put it at the bottom of C in the Rogue. This has potential. I just don't see it doing well, and it probably is going to be a leave it locals deck for the most part. Red Blue Ace is a deck that has done well since it's come out in OP13, and it will continue to do well for as long as it is a leader, in my opinion. Just being able to draw 2 off of taking a life or losing a character drawing 1 is really nice. That ability is just generically strong, and then of course the other part of it being able to pitch a dead card, or any card for that matter, to be able to go minus 2000 to a single attack is also just a generically strong ability. With rotation and also the ban, your deck list changes a bit. You don't have access to Red Rock, obviously you don't have access to Pudding, and you also don't have access to Roundtable, so your removal options are a little more limited in what you're trying to do. That being said, you don't have to worry about being hand sniped by any blue decks, so the amount of cards you can hoard is just insane. So you can feel comfortable going and taking hits and then also blocking things with Marco and having like 20 cards in hand. That's not a problem. In fact, I've been playing this deck and I almost deck out sometimes based off of how many cards I can just draw. It is a strong leader overall. I think that people have figured out a little bit more how to pilot into it. Green Mihawk definitely had its number last set, and I think it will continue to have its number into this set, but I don't think you're gonna have to worry about things like Blue-Yellow Boa or Blue-Yellow Nami as much, having to snipe your hand. Those are a couple of its harder matchups because of the fact that they could just putting you out of nowhere, and you're already getting hit by 6 to 8k every turn, a lot of times, sometimes. So this leader, I think, is probably gonna still be a strong leader in the OP15 meta. The 7-cost Zoro is a really good addition to the deck. It replaces what was the 9-cost Newgate from OP02, and so that was another card that got rotated out, but we have replacement for that, so that's fine. I'm going to put this in the event topping deck. I think if you take this deck to a tournament, it is a consistent deck overall, and the game plan for it stays the same. The 8-cost event and the 10-cost Newgate haven't been replaced, so of course this leader doesn't really change in its power level, and I don't think it got any stronger per se based off of this set, but it definitely covered some of its weaknesses with the 7-cost Zoro, and of course changes its game plan from more of a removal to something more of a mid-range game plan. So I think that this deck overall is going to be really strong in the OP15 meta. VV is a deck that has been really poorly piloted overall. I think that it is a deck that I am probably coping on a little bit, but I've noticed that the win rate for this deck just has been abysmal. There haven't been too many people been able to pilot it very well. On the ranked ladder, it suffers into Treasure Cups and regionals that we've seen so far. I think one may have placed in the top 32 out of all of them. And so, yeah, this deck has definitely performed pretty poorly. That being said, I think it's a little bit of, it came out midway through OP14, so people were trying to pilot it, figure it out, also playing into things like Blue-Yellow Boa, into Blue-Yellow Nami, and of course having to worry about Pudding and not having a huge hand size as well was a problem. This deck, of course, doesn't have to worry about that as much, and you can draw a lot more and be more comfortable with that. So along the same lines as Ace, it doesn't have to worry about its hand size as much against some of the decks that were Pudding abusers, in my opinion, those being Boa and Nami, of course. This deck, I think, is probably going to be a low competitive or a high rogue deck. I think that if you're taking this to a tournament, I think you have to have a lot of repetition on this deck and understand what your lines are. I don't think it's a deck you can easily just take to a tournament and do well. And I think that people might not necessarily know what to do against it. And so if you have the time to put into this deck, I would say that it might reward you. But of course, there probably are better decks out there overall. I'm going to put it at the bottom. I want to put it at the bottom of competitive, but this one also might change to the top of rogue based off of how we look at the other decks. Red Blue Lucy, a new leader from OP15, is a leader that says when attacking and on the opponent's attack, you can trash any number of events or stage cards from your hand and you get plus 1,000 power for each of those. So very similar to how Red Ace was before he got rotated out, which is a nice little flavor win there. And then the second part of his ability says that anytime you activate an event card that is a cost of 3 or higher, you may then draw 1 card for the turn. So that coupled with the fact that Pudding is banned means that you're going to be drawing a lot of cards and hoarding those cards for endgame. You play a lot of tall mid-range blockers with the new 7-cost Sabo that activates a Dressrosa event from hand. And the game plan is very simple. Control the opponent's board as best to your ability, draw through your deck with Cavendish, establish blockers through the 1-cost Rebecca or the 7-cost Sabo, and then go for game when you have Roger available. So this deck is a very strong deck overall, and it answers a lot of what I think will be strong decks in the meta. I think this deck is it's a high A or a low S. I'm going to put it at the low S for now because I do think that this is one of the few decks that has removal at its disposal. A lot of removal is not necessarily as strong as it was in the previous sets. We have a lot more anti-removal cards, and also on top of that, some of the big game changers for removal with the 6-cost Red Rock is just gone. So you have to find ways in order to be able to remove things a lot easier, and especially with cards having increased cost sizes once they hit the field, Black doesn't do it nearly as well anymore. So unfortunately, and I guess fortunately for Lucy, Lucy is basically the sole removal deck out there right now based off of the events that he's running. I think Lucy has a really good matchup into the blue-yellow decks, both Nami and Boa. If Emu is very prevalent, then I think it has a solid Emu matchup. That one is probably a little bit more questionable, but I do think it is more winnable than some of the other decks you could take into Emu, for instance. And where it does struggle, it will struggle against decks that go wide. Against Purple Enel, which we'll see later on, Purple Enel is a deck that I think will see a lot of representation to begin with, and probably will be one of the strongest decks out of the gate. And I think that based off of the pilot, it could be Purple Enel favored, it could be Lucy favored. So as a result, I do think that this deck is very strong. I think it will be a better deck than Red Blue Ace for a tournament, but I think this is one that you have to put a lot of practice into because there are certain lines that aren't necessarily clear to begin with. Red Purple Luffy is a deck that also benefits from the 7-cost Zoro greatly, and on top of that, it's a Gum Gum Giant user. So the combination of those two things alone, I think make this a very strong rogue deck. I don't necessarily think a lot of people are going to be using this deck per se. I think if you're going to be using a deck that uses Gum Gum Giant, you might want to use Blue Purple Luffy, but this deck definitely has a lot of advantages to playing it. The 8-cost Roger, and of course the 7-cost Zoro. So those cards being able to permanently buff your leader for a whole turn cycle make it a very strong deck in my opinion. I think it's actually probably a very strong rogue deck, and it could also potentially be a competitive deck. I might put it above Roger and what it's trying to do. So I'm going to put it at the bottom of B for now. I think it's a very strong deck. I think the fact that it has just great cards in general and great access to certain game-winning cards like Roger. You could also run 10-cost Shanks if it wants. The variety of cards you could run with this deck and the game plan you take with it make it a very tanky leader that is very difficult for a lot of decks to get past. Red Purple Sugar was a deck that benefited from Purple Doflamingo getting a lot of support, plus also EBO3 giving it a few things as well. But I don't think this deck is going to really perform that well in a competitive environment for the next set. This is a deck that I think is more of a leave at locals deck. It doesn't get anything from Purple and it doesn't get anything from Red that we'll be able to use for this set, and because it didn't do that well in the past couple of weeks, I expect it to probably just be a good deck to take to a locals, have fun with. It will still be strong, but it won't be one that will be a winning deck at a regional or treasure cup, in my opinion. On to Red Purple Roger. The same thing that I talked about with Red Purple Luffy applies to Red Purple Roger, except the fact that you don't run Gum Gum Giant in this deck, but you are a 7k leader once you're at 10 Dawn, which is really easy to hit. And then, of course, being able to buff your leader with the 7-cost Zoro, and, of course, with the 8-cost Roger. Both of those cards are just tremendously strong in this deck, and you can run a whole slew of other things as well. I think this leader is going to be a competitive leader, probably towards the tail end of it. I think it's a little bit better than Red Purple Luffy and what it's trying to do because of the fact that once you do hit that 10 Dawn, you're rewarded for being, 5 life and then a 7k leader. So, and of course, the other thing to mention with this leader that I didn't mention with Red Purple Luffy is that Red Rock is gone. So the big thing that you could do against Roger is just use Red Rock to be able to answer its threats. Sure, Rygo in yellow is back, but that doesn't really mean too much because if you're having to go down to 1 against this deck, you're probably in a little bit of trouble unless, of course, you are yellow Enel. But this deck overall, having some of its threats removed from the metagame altogether, whether that's Pudding or Red Rock, I think make it a little bit stronger. And I, of course, with the 7-cost Zoro, could see this being a competitive deck. Red-Black Kobe got some good support in EBO 3. It also got some pretty good support in EBO 4, but I think the timing for this leader is a little bit off. We noticed it do well in the East because the meta was slightly different. They weren't fully into OP15 quite yet. And as a result, I don't know if this deck will do quite well into some of the decks that will perform well going into the OP15 meta. I do think this is a strong leader. The game plan for it is pretty solidified. I think the deck list out there with the new Kobe that we have is really strong. This is one that I think is a highly competitive deck. I think that we will probably see a few people pilot it and do well with it because I'm going to say that a lot of people are going to be forgetting about Kobe overall. I think people are going to be more interested in Nami or Lucy or Ace or Emu or any of the other decks that will be probably consistently topping as well. But I think Kobe's one that is a strong deck, and I don't think you should forget about it. I think it's a deck you should respect, and it's one that I don't see a lot of people like vying to go play out, but it's one that I definitely think will do well in the OP15 meta, but it probably has a little bit of consistency issues. Card draw issues are some things that it struggles with. The new Kobe helps fix that a little bit, but I think if it can get its card draw issues down, then this deck is quite the tremendous powerhouse. I did mention that Lucy is probably the only removal deck, but that's not true. Actually, Kobe is one of the other few removal decks that we have. It's removal in the form of combat, being able to reduce your opponent's character's power, and then attacking into active characters makes this leader very strong. The fact that a lot of the anti-removal that we're seeing now is through characters that are like 1 cost, preventing through events or effects rather. The fact that you can remove your opponent's board by just attacking into it makes this leader really strong, and I think the stocks on this leader will go up over time. I'm quite the believer in Red-Black Sabo. I think this leader in the previous set was really strong, having access to blockers that are pretty much immovable because of the fact that they buff themselves cost-wise. So things like Red Rock was like the only answer to some of the things that you could play out. And if your opponent's using a Red Rock on like a 6-cost blocker Sabo that's actually 8 cost on the field, that felt good, but also that means that now that Red Rock's gone, your opponents don't have access to stuff like that nearly as easily. And of course, Red-Black Sabo taking advantage of the 7-cost Zoro that comes out is a strong deck for that. I think this is probably one of the most competitive decks out of the B tier. The reason I'm not putting it into the A tier quite yet is because when we have things like Purple Enel that go very wide against decks like Sabo obviously wants to take life, but it doesn't want to take that much life. And of course, that's going to be a problem for this deck, having to deal with decks that might go very wide to start off the meta. I think as the meta resolves and people figure out how to play against certain decks, I could see Sabo rise up a little bit more. Right now, I'm going to put it at the top of competitive. This is probably the top deck out of competitive right now that we have talked about, and it might also be the top deck out of competitive as we go along. I'm pretty confident in this deck overall, but we'll have to see as we go along and talk about different leaders. Red, Yellow, Bello, Betty. I think this deck is an answer to decks in the meta. So if decks that are 6k in power become very prominent and not a lot of things can answer those decks, then I think Bello Betty is a deck that we will see rise up. I think in the meantime, though, it will be a Leave It Locals deck. It is a strong deck. It's one that if it sees its curve, it goes second. It's just almost impossible to stop. And it has a really good matchup into like Ace or Blue, Purple, Luffy, but those decks aren't going to be as highly represented as maybe other decks in the meta. So as a result, I think it's going to be a Leave It Locals deck. Red, Yellow, Sabo is, I think, going to be a strong rogue tier deck. I don't necessarily see this doing well in a competitive environment, but I do think that the fact that Yellow is just, I wouldn't say broken, but it's close to broken with the support that it gets. And on top of that, this leader already had a pretty solid showing with the Thriller Bark Pirates package. Makes this leader a kind of an annoyance, actually, but it is one that I think is a strong rogue tier deck. It's definitely better than Odin and I think Krieg, in my opinion, at what it's trying to do. I think it has a better matchup spread than those decks into some of the top tier decks overall. The fact that it can just continue to survive, continue to heal. The 4-cost yellow Zoro in this deck is insane. Of course, things like Borsalino and Quasar are also things you could abuse in this deck as well. I don't see it being a top 32 deck per se. I don't think it's one that's going to be a deck that will go far into a bracket run. If it does, that's really good for that person, but overall, I don't expect it to. Red Yellow Bonnie is a new leader from EBO4 that says on your opponent's turn, if you have 1 or less life, this leader gains plus 2,000 power, and then activate main once per turn, give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 1,000 power, and then if you have 2 or more life, take one of your life cards. Both of those abilities are very powerful. I think the fact that you can prevent yourself from being starved of resources is very nice, and of course with yellow having access to a lot of ways to heal, I think that this deck will see some competitive play. The fact that its top end is pretty threatening with the 9-cost Rush Bonnie ripping a life and then also rushing in, and then you also have access to the 10-cost 12,000 power Luffy from EBO4. That's a yellow card that says pitch a card from hand. You have 2,000 power until the end of your opponent's next turn. Oh yeah, and then the other thing, if you're at 1 or less life, it's a 9-cost instead of 10. So overall, I think that those tools are very strong. You can use things like the unblockable red Sanji to make things really interesting for your opponent. You're a really defensive leader. Once you get down to that 1 life, it's really not necessarily hard, but it's a lot harder for opponents to crack through a 7k leader, and especially if you use things like the 7-cost Rush character Zoro or like that 10-cost Luffy, you're a 9k leader on defense with 1 life usually, and you can heal back up with Borsalino pretty easily. So this leader is going to be one that you should expect to see in the competitive environment. I think it's a very strong leader overall. I could see it showing itself probably in the top 32 as like a 1 or 2 conversion rate, but I do think that this deck is one that's rather straightforward in its game plan. Once you figure out what it's trying to do, you can play around it and beat it somewhat easily. So I do think that Red Yellow Bonnie is a deck that you should consider for a Treasure Cup, regional, whatever it may be. So I'm going to put it into the high B tier. I don't know if it's better than Kobe or not. It's probably around here. I'd say these are all very strong decks, these 4, and then VV is definitely one that is probably where it starts to trail off a little bit. On to Green Uta, this deck got some support in EBO3. It didn't really get anything from OP15, and the support that it got from EBO3 made it a little bit stronger in its game plan, but I think overall we've just not seen too much from this deck. Since its release, it has probably performed pretty mediocrely. I think probably topping maybe a set or 2 along the way. I just don't see it doing well in OP15, so I'm going to put it at the leave it locals tier. Green Bonnie is just a deck that I feel like will never die. It's just a generically good leader ability, being able to rest any attack, whether a leader or character for 1 Dawn, is always going to be really strong. It did lose the 10-cost Doflamingo, but I think a lot of deck lists have started to opt to like get rid of that card anyway, so not really the biggest deal for this leader. What's really important here is that you have ways to deal with the board that a lot of other decks don't. So the way that Bonnie deals with board is freezing the opponent's characters or preventing them from attacking, and so you have things like 5-cost Carrot, you have things like the Stun Bonnie, the 5-cost Stun Bonnie. I think there's a new Bonnie that came out in EBO3 as well that prevents an 8-cost from resting. So all of those cards alone are going to be really strong tools for you to be able to combat a lot of the decks in the meta. On top of that, cards like Electrical Luna are going to be MVPs in OP15, being able to prevent cards from being restood at the end of the opponent's turn, such as against Lucy. All of their characters for the most part are 7 or lower, so Electrical Luna just screws up everything they're trying to do. Same thing with Purple Enel. Being able to freeze all of their characters is going to be a great way to bypass the huge 6-cost 10,000 power characters they have. So I think Bonnie is actually positioned to be a really good deck overall. I would say this is probably like middle of the pack in competitive. I would expect to see this deck piloted by the few Bonnie mains that still stick to this deck overall, but those that are going to be on this deck will have access to tools to be able to freeze what their opponent's trying to do, and as a result, I think that kind of interaction will be king in this meta. Same thing with Carrot. I think Carrot kind of falls in the same line as Bonnie. Nothing really got rotated out for Carrot, and Carrot also has a way to search Electrical Luna and also has ways to search out Carrots. I think Bonnie could probably do the same as well, but I think overall it's a lot easier for Carrot to do that, and so Carrot's probably in the same vein as Bonnie, being able to control a lot of mid-range decks or even aggro decks. You don't have the 8-cost Kid, like I didn't even mention that with Bonnie, but I don't think it matters anymore either, and you didn't really run it in Carrot to begin with. So I'm going to put Carrot around the same as Bonnie, because I think that both of these decks operate very similarly in controlling what the opponent's trying to swing with. They both do it in different ways. I think actually Carrot might be a little bit more consistent now into the OP15 meta based off of just what you can search out and what you find, but I do think that both of the power levels of these decks are very similar. Green Jinbei is a deck that I put into the Rogue tier last set, and I think that it also kind of is, it's one that I expect it to probably do well at a local event. I could see it doing well. I just don't think a lot of people are going to pilot it, and Unfortunately, it didn't get too much in the color of green for it to really take advantage of. I do think it has a couple of good cards that did come out, like the 4-cost Arlong is one that you might want to consider running in this deck. But I think Jinbei overall will probably not have too good of a showing, so I'm going to put it at the Leave It Locals tier. I don't expect this deck to really do too well. I hope it does better. I hope it's one that you can find in the Rogue tier eventually. But I don't think it will do well at all in this set. It's kind of funny how Green Zoro fell off like the set after it came out. Like it was really strong the immediate set that it came out, and then right after that with Emu just completely dumpstering it, it didn't really have too strong of a showing after that. And then of course it kind of got crept by Mihawk after that, being, I think Mihawk's probably the best green deck out there, spoiler alert. But with Zoro, it's still a deck that you should always consider to see, and maybe at some stage of a tournament. It's one that it still has a strong game plan. It just goes Unga Bunga, hits the thing, and then hits your face. I do think that this deck has a new tool in green. I said that the other green decks didn't get too much support, but there's a new Brook that rests a character, and then you can trash it and then restand a character that's 8 cost or less. So that is a deck that actually uses this character. I don't know if that's going to be enough to really push it into a strong competitive deck. I would say it's like at the top of the C tier. It's a deck that you should probably expect to see maybe once in a tournament run, and you might want to be respectful of it because it can pop off. But it's one that I don't see consistently getting to the top tier, especially when there's decks that can heal. Like a lot of yellow right now is just the bane of Zoro. Any deck that heals up is going to cause Zoro to have issues, have problems. And then also Emu is going to be a deck that we'll see. And those decks in the meta will probably cause Zoro to not do nearly as well as it would if those decks weren't as strong. On to Green Mihawk. I think that this deck performed very well in OP14, and I think it will continue to perform well in OP15. Not a lot has changed for it. I think just the game plan has changed a little bit. You have to be a little bit more aware of tapping your thing sideways, which I think you always kind of had to be, especially against decks like Red Blue Ace when they had things like Roundtable. You don't have to worry about removal nearly as much. And of course, with Putting Gone, this deck is one that got victimized by Putting quite often because it had a really large hand size. Most of those cards were bricks anyway, but it didn't matter. You had a huge hand size, which means more options to play things. So Putting definitely hurt this deck a lot. And so with Putting gone, Red Rock gone, I think Mihawk actually will strive a lot more. I think that the other decks in the meta will also be around the same power level, so I could expect this to be an event-topping deck. I think this is the best green deck to take, so if you're looking to play green, this is probably the best deck to take out of all the green options, but of course, every green option is a little bit different in how they play. I would be very surprised if I didn't see this deck top in an event for sure. On to Green Blue Zoro and Sanji, with Jinbei being unbanned, the blue Jinbei, I think that this deck actually uses that card pretty well, but it's one that I'm always going to put this in the rogue tier. It's one of those decks that has like one hit KO potential, like it could just kill you in one turn because of just how many swings sometimes it can produce. And on top of that, with the 6-cost Brook being able to be added to this deck, I think that this deck could use that. I don't know if it will, but it could make things a little bit spicy. I would like to see this deck do well. I always want to see this deck do well, and I think I'll always put this deck in the C tier, just because it's one of those that I always respect it and I can see it doing well in general. But realistically, it's probably more of a Leave It Locals deck, so we'll put it at the bottom of the C tier. Green Purple Limb is a deck that I think a lot of people just have forgotten about in general. We haven't seen it do well in a competitive environment in quite some time, but it's one of those decks that just is always there and you should always be aware about. It got a recent support piece with I think it's a Purple Limb 2K counter that buffs its entire board and also the leader by 1,000 power, making it very hard to counter out of a lot of attacks, especially when they go very wide as they do. And so Purple Limb, I think, is also a deck that you could consider to probably take to a tournament. It's a deck that I think if you put a lot of practice into it, it will reward you. I think that there's some people that have definitely noticed that with this leader overall. I'd be willing to put this in the rogue tier deck. I could see this potentially bumping up if more people try to play it. But it's one of those decks that is, I think these rogue tier decks could potentially, like these three, could potentially make their way into the top 32 pretty easily. But it just matters on the pilot and the amount of people playing it, of course. Green Purple Luffy, another victim of Putting, is no longer barred by that card. So this leader is now free to take as many cards and hits as it wants. I think that this leader is a great aggro leader. I think it's probably towards the bottom of the competitive tier. I think it will continue to do its thing. It has a very simple game plan of establish as many Sanji and Puddings as possible, pressure your opponent down to 0, and then rest the things that they have established, whether that's blockers or their Dawn with things like Dead Man's Game. So you have access to cards like that, and they're all searchable too. You also have 6-cost Brook to add into the deck if you want an additional spicy pick. So that's a card to consider to add into the green-purple Luffy repertoire. I think it's a competitive deck. I always will consider this a competitive deck unless it just absolutely gets dumpstered by something in the top tier. But I do think that the fact that the pudding is gone, some more removal is gone, like 9-cost Mihawk, which was a great way for like UP Luffy, for example, to deal with this deck. Those cards are now out of the meta. And as a result, I think this deck gets a little bit stronger, but I do think that the other power level of some of the cards like Yellow got make it where it's not necessarily going to overrun anybody. Green-Black Perona got some interesting support, both in EBO3 and then also with OP15. There's some Thriller Bark Pirate support that it gets in OP15, and then of course the event that can play out a 6-cost and a 4-cost from EBO3. Make this leader worth experimenting with. I think this leader is a cope deck overall, but it has potential to swarm the board a lot easier than other decks might in this meta, and I don't know if people are ready for that or might expect that. It has the swarm potential of Limb, but a little bit later than Limb, so I do think that this is a rogue deck. Surprisingly enough, usually I'd put this at a leave it locals, but because it got a lot of support that actually just really helps its game plan, I'm going to put it at the C tier. Now, if 8-cost Gecko Moria was unbanned along with other things, I think that this would probably be a low competitive deck, but I think they're holding this deck back on purpose by not unleashing 8-cost Gecko Moria back into the meta. Next up with Green-Black Brook. This is a new leader from OP15 that has a very interesting game plan. I respect this game plan quite a lot. It has the ability of when you hit 0 from your deck, you don't actually lose. You lose at the end of the turn that you hit 0. And then the other part of the ability is once per turn, you may trash 4 cards from the top of your deck. And then if you have 0 cards in the turn in which you did this ability, you can restand one of your characters. So as you can probably put together, this is a combo deck trying to be able to get multiple swings in on the very last turn in order to win the game. The reason this leader is rather more potent than you might expect is because of the fact that it plays a lot of strong bodies in the mid game. So you have the 5-cost Pirate Docking, which buffs itself and gets back a 2-cost Straw Hat character. On top of that, you have access to the 8-cost 6,000 power Nami in black that revives a character that's 7,000 power and gives it rush in the same turn, so you can bring back some interesting cards. You also have access to the 2-cost Zoro, which basically that's a blocker that prevents any of your characters from being removed, and instead you have to like bottom deck it if that's the case, or remove it, I think, trash it instead. So you have access to some interesting tools. You have access to being able to rest things with Dead Man's Game. This is a combo deck, of course, and so combo decks are feast or famine, and so if you see what you're trying to do, you're going to really pop off. If you don't, then unfortunately your game plan can fall flat. As a result, because your floor is a lot higher, but also your ceiling is a lot higher too, your consistency is not necessarily the thing that will be a driving force for you to want to pilot this deck. I do think that this deck is a strong C tier. It's like the top of C, in my opinion. I said Smoker was, I think, earlier as we have gone along. I think Brook is a strong C tier deck and is one that I could see sneak into the top 32, maybe overall if you look at the conversion of this. Not a lot of people will probably pilot this deck, but I think 1 or 2 people at a tournament could expect to find their way into a top cut with this deck. But from there, I don't expect it to take a whole tournament. I really hope it does, though, because I do like the play style of this. Green-Yellow Yamato, I think, just sticks to its game plan of trying to smash face as much as possible with a lot of banish units. It has access to like 5-cost Nami now. It has access to all of the yellow slop. So as a result, I do think that this deck is pretty good because of all the yellow slop it gets. The green stuff is not necessarily too conducive to what it's trying to do. It also got a piece of support in EBO3, which is pretty strong overall, being able to put 3 Rested Dawn underneath your leader. And then also, I think if it gets KO'd, the Yamato unit, your opponent takes a life. So overall, I think this leader is pretty okay. I wouldn't say it's a strong deck overall. If you are establishing a lot of blockers, you can prevent those double attacks from coming through, and especially if they're banished double attacks, it doesn't really do much. It does have ways to rest a lot of blockers, which in this meta there will be a lot of blockers, but Yellow Slop is good enough to put it into the rogue tier, in my opinion. Green-Yellow Shirahoshi is a deck that did really well in the Heroines Cup recently. I think partially because of the fact that it plays just a lot of strong bodies and for cheap, and continues to do that into this set. I don't really think it gets too much support. Obviously, Yellow just got a lot of overtuning in general, but I don't think Shirahoshi's one that really is going to use a lot of the yellow support, like the Borsalinos or the 4-cost Zoro, for instance. I don't really see this deck using that. It continues to stick to the same game plan, and I think it does it fine. I think it's a rogue deck. I think it's a deck that you might see at a table or two, but if you see it into like round 7 and you're X1 at that point, I would be surprised. I would actually be surprised, but I would hope that it does well. The lack of support in general that it gets makes me not really want to put it too high into a tier, but I think it's probably going to be towards the bottom of the rogue tier. It's probably going to realistically be more so of a leave it locals deck in the meantime, but the recent success that it saw in the Heroines Cup means that it does have some strength overall. On to Blue Boa, I think Boa is a deck that got hurt by a lot of what's rotated out, and also the pudding ban somewhat hurt it as well. It did get Jimbei back into its rotation, so you can go like Jimbei into 4-cost Law or Jimbei into Weevil if you want and play more of that package. But I don't necessarily think that this leader really wants to do that. This leader has always really wanted to be more of a control style leader. And with a lot of its control just rotated out, I do think, and when I say a lot of its control was like the 10-cost Kaido, the bounce Kaido. It also really used Red Rock efficiently. So its game plan changes. You could build it more of a Boa tribal deck where there's a lot of like 6-cost Boas that you can play, ways to cheat those out as well. Or you could go with the 7 Warlords package, or you could do a combination of both. But I don't think any of that will be strong enough to make this a competitive deck, so I'm going to put it at the Leave It Locals tier. Kuzan's one that I don't see piloted very often, not even in ladder, but it did get a nice little support piece in EBO 4, I believe, with Isho, a 5-cost 7,000 power Isho, which we started to see a little bit of that being played in the deck. I did see some resurgence along the way, but I don't think that this deck will be one that we're going to see very often or perform very well. It does okay. It has access to being able to like freeze a unit from attacking. It has ways to remove some of the board by attacking into it with the Isho or obviously with Gravity Blade, which you can easily find with this deck. So I do think that this deck is okay. It's a solid, like if you're playing a blue deck and you're wanting a solid mid-range deck, this is your best bet. But I don't know if this deck is super competitive. It's definitely not like a Leave It Locals deck. It's not one that you should write out altogether. I think it's worth at least trying out. It's probably going to fall somewhere in the middle of the pack of rogue tier. There's a lot of rogue decks right now. I think that's kind of just what you see in a wide open format where there's a lot of decks that got some support, things that got removed from the support package, play styles change. There's going to be a lot of decks that will fly under the radar of people that people will experiment with. I think these decks are stuff that you should at least try out and maybe think about a little bit more. But once again, don't think that these are going to be consistently topping. Promo Nami was probably one of the leaders that had the shortest lifespan I've ever seen. Now, it had, for a couple of weeks, a pretty strong showing. Going into OP15, though, a lot of its cards get rotated out, and so as a result, it's kind of just unplayable. I don't think it has enough East-blue cards to be able to put into the deck, so I'm going to put it at the bottom of the F tier. This is like literally the definition of F tier, where it's unplayable, because I don't think it has enough cards to satisfy its leader ability. Blue Jimbei was a deck that I had a lot of cope for. I thought in the previous set that it was going to be a strong pick, and overall, if you expected a lot of green Mihawk, it was a really strong pick into that deck. Unfortunately, yellow starter deck 29 Luffy just had its number. It was a deck that you were really struggling against. You had to play it really well. Your opponent had to see not a lot of triggers, and as a result, it wasn't worth running this deck because of the fact that starter deck 29 Luffy didn't have to do much, and it still just beat it outright. That being said, yellow is incredibly strong into this meta, and I unfortunately have to say that Jimbei struggles into yellow because what Jimbei is trying to do is rush your opponent down to 0 and then make it so that it's really difficult for your opponent to have to counter out of hits that you're unlikely going to be able to counter out of at 0 or have unblockable events to be able to bypass blockers. So that being said, with yellow being as strong as it is in the OP15 meta and Jimbei's game plan really struggles against what yellow tries to do, I think this deck will probably, it's a really tough decision for me on this one because I do think that this deck outside of yellow is really good because of the fact that you can turn your card draw into extra Dawn to swing with, and you have access to the 8-cost Jimbei, which can bounce a 7-cost, which there's a lot of 7-cost in this meta. I think it's one that's going to be a, oh gosh, is it a competitive deck or is it a rogue deck? Is this a deck I could expect to see in the top 32 consistently? No, I don't think so. I think that there is a better blue aggro deck out there. I'm going to put Jimbei towards the middle of the pack. I will say that if you're expecting decks like Lucy or any kind of maybe purple Enel, I think this deck has a lot of potential against those decks. But if you are expecting to see a lot of yellow decks in general, good luck. Blue Rebecca is a deck, when I first saw it, was like, this leader ability is awful, and then the support came out for it, and I was like, I don't know if this leader is going to do too well, but it plays a lot of blue good stuff and can cheat out bodies for one. It can cheat out a 3-cost body that rushes in and only for 1. And that body keeps going back to hand if you KO it. And so the game plan of Rebecca is to establish a wide board with a lot of smaller swings. And then as the game goes on, you're playing some of these interesting mid-range bodies that either get tempo back into your favor, like Boa Hancock, or you're playing things like the A-cost Jinbei, which you can actually use effectively in this deck. So I do think that this leader is worth trying out, and I think it's a strong competitive pick. I think it's a deck that if you're looking for a strong mono blue leader, this is probably the best one you can pick. I would probably put it around here, probably towards the top end of competitive, because of just the fact that it has such aggressive tools at its hand. It can search and then bounce the searcher back to hand, play out a 3-cost. You don't even have to play out anything. If you want to make room on your board, you can bounce things back and have a bigger hand size as a result. With Pudding Gone, it does hurt this deck a little bit because this is a deck that really took advantage of Pudding, because of course with rush decks, and especially being in blue, getting an opponent to take life and then getting rid of their hand size right after that is a very strong play. You don't have access to that anymore, but that being said, you can just stockpile your cards in your hand a lot easier, and you can still approach your game plan the same way, being very aggressive, and then just having your opponent have more cards to counter out with is fine. Of course, yellow being in the meta, as I mentioned with Jinbei, is going to be a little bit of an issue. The fact that healing is such an easy thing for a lot of these decks to do now. If you do go against a yellow deck, you might struggle, but of course you can establish a pretty wide board very easily with this deck. And unlike Jinbei, you're not doing it at the cost of your hand size, which I think is very important. Blue-Yellow Ace is one that has passively been getting a lot of support over time, and people haven't really been paying attention to it. I recently played against one at a local, and it was a very interesting build where it was like all Whitebeard pirates. Wasn't really buying into the 2-cost kid package, which that's fine. I do think, though, that this leader with the new 5-cost Luffy is one that you should definitely try out. If that Luffy hits the board, that's just one of the strongest cards to come out of the set, and the fact that you can cheat that out for 2 and then also buff your leader in the process, and your opponent can't really use blockers or counter events easily with that card on the field, makes this leader, I think, a very strong rogue pick. I don't know if it's going to be a competitive deck. I do highly respect this deck. There's different ways to build it. Of course, you have access to the 8-cost Whitebeard event and then into a 10-cost Newgate, whether that's the Blockbeard or the Taxbeard. You could run both if you want. You have access to Jozu, 4-cost Marco, Yellow Slop. There's a lot of good things with this deck overall. I think it's a pretty strong rogue pick. I'm going to put it actually at the top of the rogue tier. There's a lot of decks, like I mentioned, in the rogue tier, but I do think that these decks all have very strong potential to pop off. They just need a strong pilot to do it. Blue-Yellow Nami is the definition of abusing the new slop that has come out with both the 4-cost Zoro and also Borsalino with the Quasar trigger. I think this is one of the decks that abused Pudding very commonly. I mean, even if you watched some of my previous games, if I went against a Nami, I was getting Pudding like 2 or 3 times in a single game. So this deck, of course, not having access to Pudding hurts it a little bit, but I do think that it still has just a strong game plan overall. It's one of the best toolbox decks out there. You can build it a couple of different ways, whether it's like the new Straw Hat Good Stuff into like the 10-cost Newgate. You can also build it Thriller Bark Pirates package, which is arguably one of the more annoying packages to have to deal with. And of course, you can actually use Raigo in this deck pretty efficiently as well, because going down to 1 doesn't necessarily mean you're losing the game, especially when you have things like Hiyori to stack that last life with a Quasar into a Borsalino to heal back up and get a blocker in the process. So yeah, this deck is going to be a deck that you'll see a lot of, and probably it will do very well at a lot of tournaments. I think a lot of people are also saying that this is one of the best decks in the format, and I can see that. Between the 5-cost Nami, 7-cost Nico Robin, 10-cost Newgate, 4-cost Marco, the 4-cost Baby 5 trigger, any of the good Jozu removal or the Nojiko removal, any of that stuff is just good. You can build it that way. Like I said, Thriller Bark Pirates package is also another way. So yeah, I will put this into the S tier. It's definitely a deck you're going to have to learn to play around, and it's a deck we're going to see quite often. It has pretty solid matchups across the board. Being a 7k leader on defense for the entire time that your opponent's swinging at you is just insane. Like overall, I don't think there's a lot that's going to be able to stop this leader. I think Lucy has a good matchup into it. Emu might have a pretty good matchup into it, but I think now with the amount of healing that Nami has, Emu might actually have a little bit of trouble getting past it consistently. Obviously, triggers matter in that matchup, but I think this leader overall is finally at a place where it is one of the best decks in the format. Along the same lines as Blue-Yellow Nami, Blue-Yellow Boa Hancock is going to be a deck that is going to be quite the menace in this environment. Where it differs from Blue Yellow Nami, though, is that Blue Yellow Nami has a better toolbox package overall. The fact that you can build it with the 5-cost Nami, 7-cost Nico Robin, you can't necessarily do that with this Boa Hancock. You're a little bit more tied into the Kuja Pirates package, which is a great package overall. But I think that a lot of people have come to understand how to play against this. That being said, it doesn't matter because of the fact that you have the Quasar event and also Borsellino to abuse. But of course, Nami has a great matchup into this deck specifically. And I think a lot of other decks are starting to be able to match the power level here. With that being said, this deck, I believe, is the biggest pudding abuser. And so with pudding gone, this deck has a lot harder time pushing past larger hand sizes. And so I do think that Boa Hancock overall is still strong. Don't get me wrong, it's like an A tier deck in my opinion, but I think if you're going to go for a blue-yellow leader, I would be prone to go for blue-yellow Nami based off of the different ways you can build it. The game plan is pretty strong. The tools that it has gotten recently are just overpowered for what it's trying to do. Boa Hancock, still a strong deck overall. Would totally expect this to win an event for sure. Of course, yellow in general is just good, so as a result, this is a good deck. Blue Purple Luffy is a deck that I personally really enjoy, and with the rotation happening and pudding taken out of the deck list, it definitely has taken a huge hit for what it's trying to do. I think that overall it will still probably be a strong deck regardless because of the fact that you can obviously draw 2 cards a turn, stack your deck once you hit to 8 Dawn, and you have access to the 8-cost Roger still, so that's not gone. I think you just change up your game plan a little bit. You could probably add in the 9-cost Rush Luffy instead, or maybe add in some different cards instead of the 9-cost Mihawk. Obviously, Red Rock is gone as well, so you're not playing as much of a removal package. So I think this leader does fall off a little bit as far as the strength of it goes, but I do think that the fact that the leader ability is just that good, and you do have access to the 9-cost Sanji to be able to cheat out a big body, can overwhelm opponents if you play it correctly. That said, I do think it's a strong competitive deck, but not necessarily one that will be consistent at what it's trying to do. I think it falls in the line of some of these other power users like the Roger or the Red Purple Luffy, so I think these decks are very similar as far as playing big bodies and being able to defend themselves pretty easily. Very similar to the promo Nami, unfortunately, UP Sanji kind of just had a very short stint in the meta with the 5-cost Reiju being able to use a Red Rock from trash or a Gravity Blade from trash. You could answer pretty much anything your opponent threw down. It was a great answer into Ace. Red Rock is being rotated out. I don't think too many of these decks ran pudding anyway, so I don't think pudding really hurt this deck overall. But Red Rock was the big thing that is being rotated out that you could use to take advantage of some of the matchups like Ace or any of the decks that went tall. So now you have a really good matchup into decks that go wide, being able to use your Gravity Blade consistently. But with the 5-cost Reiju not being able to have access to something that can answer tall things, unfortunately, there's decks that will just go unanswered against Purple Blue Sanji. So I sadly have to move this down to, I want to say, the Leave It Locals. I really hate to put this here. I want to put it into the Rogue tier because of the fact that it does have good matchups into some decks, but I think the fact that Red Rock got taken off of its plate just makes this leader a lot worse. Of course, maybe I'm a little bit short-sighted here, and maybe there's other deck lists that you can build with this leader to make it more competitive, but I think the fact that the 5-cost Reiju now really only can effectively use the Gravity Blade, obviously can use some of the other cards you have in your trash, like Black Stealth and things like that, but Gravity Blade and Red Rock were the best targets for that, and half of those targets are gone now, so this deck is a lot weaker as a result. Blue-Black Usopp is my cope pick for OP15. I think this leader got a lot of passive support over the past set or two. With EBO3, it got the 2-cost Rebecca blocker that can find a stage. And then in OP15, it got the blue Rebecca, which can grab any Dressrosa card. So it replaces the 1-cost black Rebecca that rotated out. That black Rebecca could not grab another Rebecca card, which was a huge hindrance to this deck. But now with the 1-cost blue Rebecca, that can grab any Dressrosa card and can make your finds a lot more consistent. On top of that, you have the new Viola 2K counter, which can search out other cards from Dressrosa as well. Point being, the consistency of this deck is at the best it's ever been. That being said, it did lose the 7-cost Restand Luffy and also King Kong Gun. Both of those cards were great cards for this deck specifically, but I do think the fact that you have such a hyper-consistent way of finding anything that you need helps this deck tremendously. And so I will put this at a high C tier. I think this deck is a very strong deck overall. I think a lot of people forgot about this deck or didn't pilot it to begin with. I ran this deck when OP10 was at its heyday, and so I know the power level of this deck overall, and I'm happy to say that this deck feels a lot stronger with those pieces added in from OP15. Why is it so strong? Well, the 7-cost Rebecca turn, where you can bring out a 7-cost and a 4-cost Dressrosa character, means that you have such a strong tempo play on 7 or 8. That being said, the Kairos is a great way to bounce a 5-cost. The Zoro is a great way to KO a 4-cost. So you do have removal for the mid game. But if you want to go more of a blocker route, you now have access to the 7-cost Sabo, which can play a Dressrosa event for free. So you have options there as well. On to purple, we have Purple Foxy. I think this deck is always contingent on what leaders are strong at the top. I do think it's a competitive deck overall. The support that it got from the OP14, but EBO4 purple, good stuff. It actually became a lot stronger and now has ways to draw cards, rest taller characters, being able to negate a leader swing, plus also one of your opponent's strongest characters makes this leader always somewhat relevant. And so I do think that this leader is a competitive pick. It's probably one that's probably towards the bottom of competitive. I don't necessarily see this as being a strong competitive pick, but I do think it is a good answer to certain metas. Purple Dofi is a deck that I think did pretty well in OP14. It had a pretty strong matchup spread against a lot of decks, and we saw it do well at Nats and also at Worlds. It doesn't get any support in OP15, but honestly, it doesn't really need it. I think its package that it has is strong as is. It was one of the decks that actually had a pretty strong answering into yellow in the previous set, and as a result, I think it probably has a pretty strong answer into yellow going into this set. With that being said, it does struggle against a lot of the other decks above it. I see this going into like a strong competitive, maybe middle of the pack competitive, probably around here. I do think, probably thinking in hindsight, this red-green Luffy's probably a little bit better than what I have it at. It's probably around right here. And maybe Dofi could probably be like right around this area. Maybe a little bit better than like the blue Rebecca, maybe a little bit better than red, yellow Bonnie. So I can see this being right around this area. It's a strong deck. The redirection is just a strong tool in general. And of course, having access to Virgo, preventing any kind of removal. You have access to the 10-cost Dofi. Freezing things also is very nice, especially in this meta. So yeah, I think this deck is well positioned for the OP15 competitive meta. Purple Enel is a new leader from OP15 that I think has been making a lot of waves over in the East. Its leader ability says, under the rules of this game, you can't have more than 6 Dawn in your Dawn deck, and then activate main once per turn. If it's your second turn or later, you can then stand 1 Dawn from your Dawn deck as active, and then 4 from your Dawn deck as rested, and then put 4 of your rested Dawn onto a character. So this is a highly aggressive deck. The entire support package for this is pretty much from OP15. It runs a lot of 1-cost cards that replace themselves as they get played down. All of their effects are like Dawn -1, draw a card, and then they have different effects when attacking. And then you have access to a 6-cost 10,000 power Enel that searches out any card off the top 5. You also have access to another 6-cost 10,000 power Enel that can make itself a blocker. Oh yeah, I completely forgot. Those 6-cost 10,000 power bodies also can't be removed from the field by your opponent's effects. So those cards are insane. This deck is really good. I think this deck will be a strong out-of-the-gate contender for best deck in the format. I think as we go along, this deck will be answered a lot easier. So what ends up happening with a lot of metas is that aggro decks, or like Yellow Enel, for instance, are decks that really perform well at the start of metas, and then people will start to figure out how to play against them. I think out of the gate, this deck should be expected to win tournaments or do really well into a lot of tournaments that it participates in. I think the conversion rate will be strong. I think as OP15 develops and as we go along, this will probably fall down a little bit. It might be more of an A-tier deck, but to start off with, I think this will be the best deck in the format. I've included Nico Robin in here because I think Nico Robin also is just, a yellow deck. So as a result, she's going to be just generically good. But into yellow decks, she is exceptionally good because of the fact that she just has Banish written on her leader. But this is a deck that I wouldn't really want to take to a competitive environment because of the fact that she, I think, just struggles against a lot of other decks outside of yellow. So if you expect all yellow, then absolutely take Nico Robin. You'll have a great time. But outside of that, I think she's more of a rogue pick to take to tournaments. Purple Yellow Rosinante, of course, has been a strong contender for a best deck more recently. But with OP15, I don't know if this deck is going to perform nearly as well as it has been performing because of the fact that a lot of decks around it will start to rise up in strength. Purple Yellow Rosinante doesn't really get anything from purple, and I don't think it really gets anything from yellow either. It's not really running any of the Borsalinos or the 4-cost Zoros. Those cards don't really make their way into this deck list. That being said, I think the deck list pretty much stays the same into OP15. It was a strong pick in OP14, and I think it will continue to be an A tier deck in OP15. I think it has pretty good matchups into a lot of the top tier, and of course, being able to answer Emu, being one of the few decks that can, I think makes it a strong contender. I think the reason that Purple Black King is here is because it got some support in the EBO4 aspect of things, but we saw this deck do absolutely nothing, and I will expect it to do absolutely nothing continuing into the OP15 meta. So we're going to put it here. We're going to make a quick adjustment to the starter deck 21 Luffy, because it's not the worst deck out of the F tiers, but it's close. On to Purple Black Luffy. I think that this deck finally has a little bit of a different identity going into OP15 with the black support that comes out. I think that this deck actually has a strong use case for the 8-cost Nami, being able to revive the Beer Luffy to be able to buff your leader and also give it rush in the same turn is huge. One of the things with this leader is that once an opponent got rid of the 6-cost 7,000 power purple Luffy that buffs your leader, I think that it was hard to come back from that. You had to be able to have more in hand or ways to protect it outright to begin with. But now that you have the 8-cost Nami to be able to bring it back, you're not so concerned about losing that unit because you can get it back quite easily. I do really like this leader again, but I don't think it's quite as strong as it once was. It was only really strong when the starter decks came out, and it was only really strong for like a month. And after that, it really fell off hard. I think it's starting to find a little bit of resurgence and a new identity with OP15 though, and I'm very interested to see how this deck does. I'm going to put it into the Rogue tier, probably towards the top or middle end of it, because of the fact that I do think that this deck is not necessarily as strong as these decks above it, but I think it's probably stronger than the decks below it. So I think this is a very appropriate place for this deck to be. All right, Lucci is an interesting leader to talk about because we haven't seen this leader in quite some time. Removal is not necessarily something that is as strong as it once was with all the things that have buffed its cost or have anti-removal effects now. Lucci has a different playstyle though. There's a new 4-cost Lucci that comes out in the EBO4 side of things in black that says as you fill up your trash, I think it's for like every 5 cards in your trash, you gain like +2 cost and like maybe 1,000 power, something along those lines. Point being, the more cards you fill up in your trash, the stronger that card becomes. So you can fill up your board with these 4-cost Luccis that eventually become like 12,000 power swings. It's kind of like Burgess in Blackbeard. I think this deck actually, the identity of it obviously changes completely, and it becomes a very interesting, almost like an aggressive deck with how it's trying to play. And I really like the play style here. Is this deck good though? I think it's one to experiment around with, and I'm going to probably put it into the Rogue tier. There's a lot of Rogue tier decks. There's a lot of C tier decks here, which makes me a little anxious because it means there's a lot of things to learn. But I think we're going to put this here probably around this area. I think it's a middle of the pack deck. I think it's a deck that has some really good tools at its disposal. And now you don't really have to worry about running like removal nearly as much. You probably have some ways to answer the board mid-game with like the 5-cost Kaku or like the 9-cost Stussy in the late game. Most of the game plan, though, is trying to find your 4-cost Luccis and play out as many as you possibly can. Gecko Moria, very similar to Perona, has a few Thriller Bark Pirates to be able to support its game plan. I just included it here just to mention it, but I don't think it's necessarily a deck that I would expect to do well or even be a Rogue tier deck per se. I think it's a deck you might want to take to locals, experiment around with, and have fun there, but I don't think it's necessarily that strong. On to Blackbeard, a face that we haven't seen in a hot minute, but I do think that this deck has legs yet again. Anytime we start to see yellow start to rise up, it usually means decks that can answer yellow easily, like Blackbeard, are probably good decks to play. So I would expect Blackbeard to be it's like one of those, it's a rogue pick. It's a deck that can answer certain things in the meta and has a general good game plan and could disrupt people that might not know how to play against it because they haven't seen it in a hot minute. So I'm going to put Blackbeard in the competitive tier. I don't know if it's necessarily like at the bottom of the competitive tier. I don't think that's a fair place for it to be at. It's probably somewhere around here if I had to guess. These are probably a little bit misplaced if I had to also make an assumption. So I'm going to probably bump some of these things down. I'll probably bump this to here. This is probably one of the, yeah, I think this is fine. We'll move Carrot and then also VV around this area as well. All of these are competitive decks. I could expect maybe one or two to appear in the top 32. but I think that overall, the higher we go up in this tier, the better the decks are. On to Emu. This deck hasn't changed a single thing about its game plan, and it doesn't need to. It's just a very good deck in general. We're finally getting to the point where some of the other decks are rising to meet its power level. So like Purple Enel will probably do well into it. I think Nami has more of a fair chance than it ever had. I also think that Lucy can do well into it. Ace, Mihawk, and also Rosinante are also contenders into this deck. That being said, Emu is just a good deck in general and will continue to be a good deck into OP15. I think it's an event-topping deck. I would expect it to probably be in the top 16 or even win an event. That would not be a surprise to me, but we're finally seeing where this is starting to fall off a little bit. So at least now things are starting to catch up to the OP13 meta. Black Croc is a deck that I didn't respect. I did not respect it in OP14. I enjoyed playing it quite a lot, but if I ever went against a Black Crocodile, I didn't feel like I was immediately threatened by anything they were doing. But I think I should respect it a lot more in OP15. I think with the new 7-cost Luffy, you can use that in this deck pretty efficiently and be a tanky leader, which is something that it didn't have access to previously. So getting past a 7k leader on defense is really difficult. And of course, having the 8-cost Crocodile to also prevent attacks from happening is a great way to remove the opponent's board. Now that we have, as I mentioned, a lot of tools as anti-removal, the 8-cost Crocodile is just a great way to answer a lot of that. So I do think this is a highly competitive deck. I'm going to put it towards the top of the B tier, probably towards B altogether, just like the top of B, because of the fact that I do think it has just great tools to stop the opponent from aggressing any further. It has ways to be defensive easily. And on top of that, it was one that was a huge victim to Pudding. It usually amasses a really big hand size, and Pudding just destroys that in a single play. So with that gone, Crocodile can now continue to amass that big hand size, stay healthy, stay tanky, and develop its game plan a lot easier. Black Yellow Luffy, interestingly enough, is kind of back a little bit. It's not one where it's fully back to its power level of the 8-cost Gecko Moria looping and all that stuff, but with Raigo unbanned, this is one of the decks that takes full advantage of that card. Also, you can play the 8-cost Nami if you want to, the 7-cost Nico Robin, the 5-cost Rush Luffy from OP15 is really good in this deck overall. It has a lot of tools back in its arsenal that it can take advantage of. I don't think people have made the correct list quite yet, but I do think that this deck has some potential, and I would be excited to see it do well. I'm going to put it into the Rogue tier. It's probably middle of the pack of the Rogue tier. I think it needs a solidified deck list and some people to experiment around with it, but I do think that there's some potential with this leader overall. Black Yellow Moria is a deck that I certainly didn't respect last set. I thought it was more of a rogue deck. I thought if you were a good pilot on it, it was going to be a deck that you should expect to do well with, but I didn't think enough people were going to pilot it, and I think it did have some decent showing to start off with, but it did get some interesting pieces of support. Of course, being in yellow, it got access to the 4-cost Zoro. I don't necessarily think it runs Borsalino, but the 4-cost Zoro alone is good enough for this deck, being able to play it out of trash with the 8-cost Gecko Moria trigger, and healing in the process is really annoying. On top of that, you have access to a Hogback, which can replenish your hand, but also fill up your trash in the meantime. So that card is incredible for this deck. And I think overall, the game plan of just swarming the board and being incredibly annoying while also persistently not dying makes this leader really strong. I think it's graduated to the competitive tier with those additions to the deck. I'd comfortably put it right around here. I think it's a deck that you're going to probably see a fair amount of representation on, and it's one that is quite annoying to play against based off the tools that they have. So this deck should do well. I could expect it to do well, and I hope it does. We are 10 sets past the release of Yellow Enel, and this deck still just has not died. With Raigo coming back and Pudding gone, I think this deck is actually a strong competitive pick to start the meta out with. Very similar to its purple counterpart. I think as the meta goes along, I think we'll see this deck fall off a little bit, but I do realize that this deck has a great yellow matchup in general. It obviously has access to Quasar and Borsalino, 4-cost Zoro, and the 10-cost Rush Enel, which not a lot of people saw in play because this deck by that point in time was pretty much dead on arrival. So the fact that it's back again is a little bit concerning, but obviously there's ways to answer it. I do think it's a very strong competitive deck. I will put it probably around here. I would expect this to do well at an event in the first couple of events that we see, but as the meta goes along, I do think that this deck will fall off. And its Sky Island counterpart with Kalgara is also a deck that massively got buffed in this set with the Sky Island support in general. On top of that, you have access to all the yellow good stuff, and I do think this deck has a lot of legs to be able to do well at least in the start of the competitive environment. This deck is a little bit different than some of the other yellow decks in the fact that it goes very wide, very fast, and it's hard to handle a board that goes as wide as it does, as quickly as it does. And on top of that, it can run things to prevent its board from being removed because a lot of its characters are 6 cost or lower. And even further on top of that, you have the 5 cost Rush Luffy, which I think does wonders in this deck overall. To be honest, I think that card should be included in any yellow deck, at least a one of, because of just how strong it is overall. With Calgara, though, I do expect it to do pretty well, and I think it's probably a better pick for a yellow deck than a Nell because of the fact that I think just going really wide means that its game plan is a lot easier to handle. With a Nell, you're kind of like sitting around and kind of playing sometimes a starve game. If you want to play aggressive, you can. You're just basically being an annoyance to make it to 10 and play big bodies. Vegapunk is also a Quasar Borsalino abuser, although I will argue that this deck is probably the deck it was made for. But you can easily just place the Quasar into your life and get the Borsalino guaranteed. But that being said, it doesn't really have too strong of a game plan outside of what it's trying to do of building one body a turn and then swinging really aggressively with that one body that you've already established the previous turn. Obviously, with the 9-cost Bonnie, that's a really good card for this deck as well. Some of the other yellow decks will do better than this Vegapunk. I do think it's a rogue tier deck. I think it's a deck that probably will do fine by itself. It will be a deck that we wouldn't, or at least I shouldn't expect to win, but it's a deck that I think is strong because it's just yellow. Piss Kid is a deck we haven't seen in a little bit either, but it also does well into yellow because of the fact that it has access to Basil Hawkins, and also the 8-cost Kid is easily searchable in that deck. And you also got a piece of support. It's a yellow Yarouge, which has pseudo rush if you pitch a card. That's a Supernova. I don't know if this deck is going to be that good, though. I think it's a deck that might need a little bit of cooking with. I could see it being a competitive deck. It's a deck that is strong, but I just don't think people are really respecting it as a yellow leader in general because there's much better yellow leaders out there. The game plan is pretty simple. Just try to crit your opponent's life and establish blockers along the way, which is a pretty good game plan overall. I think it's a rogue deck. I don't think it's a deck that's going to be a competitive deck overall. I wouldn't expect it to win or place in the top 32 very often. It might sneak its way in there if somebody is piloting it and has a good run. That being said, I'm kind of convincing myself to move it down a little bit, maybe move these up a little bit more. But yeah, I do think that Kid is, once again, yellow. It's not really abusing the new yellow cards in general, but it is a good deck that can answer some of the meta. So as a result, I think it's a C tier deck. I think Bonnie is one of the few solid yellow aggressive decks. Unfortunately, though, I do think that there's a better yellow aggressive deck that we get in OP15. And as a result, I think she gets a little bit power crept out of what she's trying to do here. So I'm going to put Bonnie, because nothing really changes outside of obviously the stuff that she gets from like Borsalino. Quasar has been around for a little bit. 4-cost Zoro could be used in these decks, but I don't think it's necessarily as strong as some of the other decks we'll get to in a second. On to starter deck 29, Luffy. This is a vanilla leader for most of the game because you're a 6 life. You do get access to all of the new yellow stuff, and of course the yellow stuff that you could access to before with the 5-cost Nami, the 7-cost Nico Robin. All of that makes this leader really strong. I do think it's a competitive deck. I don't necessarily think it's a deck that will have a high representation because of the other yellow Luffy that we get in OP15. I would be comfortable putting it at the low end of B. That being said, I don't really respect this deck too much because of the fact that it is a vanilla leader for most of the game. The 6 life is good though, but not good enough for it to be an event topping deck. Then finally, we have yellow Luffy from OP15. This says if your Sky Island character with 6,000 power or more would be removed from the field, you may then take one of your life instead. This can be activated as many times in turn as you would like. So basically what this is doing is protecting your board from any kind of removal effects, but also any kind of battle. So your opponent has to make a really interesting decision of, do I attack your board to then prevent any kind of triggers from happening, or do I just go for face and try to rush you down and then take care of your board after? So it makes it very interesting, but of course you have lots of tools to be able to heal up. With this being a Straw Hat and Sky Island leader, you have access to the 5-cost Nami if you want to build it that way, 7-cost Nico Robin as well. You also have access to the 10-cost Rush Anel from, I think, PRBO2, so you have access to be able to heal up that way. You have the Gum Gum Golden Rifle, which is a new event that can heal you if you're at 0. You have Borsalino, you have the 4-cost Zoro as well on top of that, and most importantly, on top of that, the 5-cost Rush Luffy, which I've talked about a bunch, but I didn't even explain what it does. It says if your opponent would activate blocker or an event, you then flip the top card of your life, and based off of the cost of that card, you add 1,000 power per cost to this character. So if you reveal a 10 cost character at the top of your life, you get 10,000 power on top of the 7,000 that you're already swinging with. So insane card overall. And this yellow Luffy uses it the best. With all of that being said, I think that this is an A tier deck. I think that the fact that it protects its board and can establish a wide board and also can swing in really quickly with the 5-cost Luffy. And also on top of that is hard to kill because you just continue to heal off of different effects, makes this leader a very competitive leader overall. It has a great matchup into Purple Enel and also Lucy, so if you're expecting those matchups, then I think this leader can do pretty well. So there you have it. This is the tier list for what I consider to be the best decks in the OP15 format. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Let me know in the comments below. All I ask is that you be respectful. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.